In Castro's Cuba, the scariest weapon wasn't a gun, it was a letter. One stamp, one summons saying you could vanish into the UMAP forced labor camps in Camagüey, sent to the cane to be corrected. So here's the question. How does a revolution that promised liberation end up building fences and calling it help? I'm Arturo, and this is Latin Lore, from Latin America's history to mysteries and true crime, to local legends, whispering Latin intrigue. Every tale is verified in archives before it reaches your headphones. Hit subscribe. Fresh revelations drop every week, ready for your next campfire debate. When the night gets quiet in Havana, you can hear paper breathing, an official envelope on a table, a stamp like a dry kiss, and inside it a sentence that rearranges your whole life. That's the contradiction we're walking into. A revolution that promised to break chains, then learned how to manufacture new ones. Out of ink, out of neighbors, out of routine. Tonight we follow one letter into the cane, where barbed wire learned to speak like law. The mystery is not whether the camps existed. The mystery is how a nation can say liberation with one breath and say correction with the next, without choking. In the mid-1960s, the military units to aid production, UMAP, operated as forced labor re-education camps in Camagüey. The files whisper, the street remembers, and the land keeps receipts even when paper is burned. And once you understand the machinery, you realize the real mystery is how ordinary routine can be turned into a weapon. There's a reason the dates keep sliding in memory, like a shadow that won't hold still. The machinery begins earlier than the public admits. The UMAP was launched in 1964, then began operating openly, publicly, officially in 1965, as if a fence becomes more legitimate once it has a name. By 1968, removals and closures were already starting in practice, and by 1969, the system was completely shut down. The files whisper this timeline, even when the state tries to smooth it into one clean sentence. And the summons letter wasn't floating in folklore. It sat inside the law. Compulsory Military Service, the SMO, was framed through Law 1129 with an age range that reached from 15 to 27, a net wide enough to catch boys and young men at the edge of life. The standard term was 3 years, and that number mattered because it made exile feel permanent while still pretending it was temporary. 3 years is long enough to break a rhythm, long enough for a neighborhood to forget your face, long enough for fear to become routine. Up close, the camps were not abstract evil, they were logistics. Many sites were built like small military towns, barbed wire fences about 10 feet high, guard posts, barracks, and a daily schedule that treated bodies like fuel. Accounts describe camps often lacking running water or electricity because discomfort was part of the lesson, not an accident. A typical camp held around 120 men, organized into companies and squads so discipline could be counted like inventory. And the wage, about 7 pesos a month, worked like a cruel joke. Payment used to pretend this was service, not captivity. If you want to see how a state manages memory while the crime is still breathing, look at the newspapers. On April 14th, 1966, Granma ran a major piece, Luis Báez writing the units as honorable, even promising visits like Mother's Day, clean images, clean language, a clean lie. Verde Olivo repeated the pattern. Production victories, smiling macheteros, the flag of the millionaire. And the sharpest proof is what never appears. In all that ink, homosexual prisoners are not named, not once. That omission is not innocence, it's a strategy. If you want to understand how this was possible, you have to taste the atmosphere first. After 1959, the island moved fast, with schools, clinics, literacy, and the promise that the poor would finally be seen. Cuba was not floating in a vacuum. Cold War pressure tightened like a belt, the U.S. embargo pressed on the ribs, and the country leaned into Soviet trade to keep breathing. Siege mentality is a weather system, and weather becomes policy when it lasts long enough. Now add the oldest character in this story, sugarcane. Even when flags change, cane still demands bodies. Cuba's economy had been built around sugar for generations, and the revolution inherited that spine whether it liked it or not. Money, fuel, machinery, everything ran through harvest totals, export agreements, and deadlines that didn't care about speeches. So there's a practical panic under the ideology. Who will cut the cane year after year when the nation is trying to prove it can survive? Here is the dangerous thing about panic. It teaches the power to treat people like resources. When hands don't volunteer, the state starts drafting bodies and calling it aid. That's not a metaphor. It's a naming trick. You turn coercion into service by changing the label. You turn punishment into patriotism by putting it in uniform. And once you do that, a fence doesn't need to look like a fence. It can be presented as a classroom with a wire. But wire alone doesn't run a system. Surveillance does. In the neighborhoods, committees for the defense of the revolution, the CDR, kept eyes and lists, a notebook, a whisper, a report, who skipped meetings, who prayed too loudly, who dressed wrong, who listened to music that smelled foreign, who walked with someone the block didn't approve of. In a place where unity was sacred, privacy became a luxury item. The street learned that the difference could be filed as danger. This is how the line is built, not only with police, but with social habits, with a neighbor's glance that lasts a second too long, with the way people lower their voice when a name is spoken, with the small obedience of not asking questions in public. The revolution's early consolidation taught a lesson that later crackdowns would repeat. You don't have to arrest everyone. You only have to make everyone feel arrestable, and the fear will patrol the street for you. The press was folded into the same architecture. Loud truth was the truth approved for print, and everything else became rumor, meaning deniable. The official line insisted there would be no mass media for those labeled counter-revolutionary because media belonged to the people, so enemies deserve no microphone. Once suffering loses its public voice, it becomes a private whisper, and private whispers are easy to call lies. Silence becomes a moat. Silence becomes policy. Listen to how the moral logic hardened. In those years, the revolution framed itself as a fortress under threat, foreign sabotage, exotic currents, and capitalist vices. In that fortress mindset, many kinds of differences were treated as one danger, not as separate issues, but as the same stain: religiosity, vagancia, delinquency, homoerotism, dissent, no hierarchy, same suspicion, same urgency, same answer. You don't debate with a stain, you scrub it out. And scrubbing is where the UMAP enters. The UMAP did not fall from the sky as a sudden accident. In public discourse, you can see the groundwork being laid. In March of 1963, Fidel Castro spoke about fighting the past, its reactionary ideas, nefarious habits, and vices. He singled out growing religious groups, naming Jehovah's Witnesses for refusing arms and flag oaths, naming other evangelical currents for Sabbath observance, and pointing to foreign leadership as suspicious. Those words are not just words, they are a map. They point to future measures. And here's the part that matters if anyone tries to dismiss this as a few bad guards. The chain of command rose high. The UMAP's leadership roster in the record includes names like Ernesto Casillas at the top, with Reynaldo Mora, José Ramon Silva, José Sandino, and Walfrido Lao Estrada in the upper structure. In other words, this wasn't a rumor drifting around the cane. It was a design system with signatures, ranks, and responsibility. The street remembers that design even when the paperwork is missing. And while ideology set the stage, economics sharpened the knife. The state planned for an enormous sugar drive leading toward the 10 million harvest of 1970. The message from above is that in a socialist country, nothing is more important than creative work. Work becomes not only survival, but virtue. The island was told again and again that labor in the fields was sacred and cleansing. When work becomes moral law, nonconformity becomes sin, and sin in a fortress is treated like treason. So now picture a young man coming home in Havana in May 1966. The heat is not romantic, it sticks to your shirt like a confession. José Caballero Blanco closes his door and finds the envelope waiting. Compulsory Military Service, the SMO, summons him for 3 years. The letter doesn't say Camagüey, it doesn't say labor. It doesn't say camp, it only says report. Your body has already been promised. Your schedule is no longer yours. The paper has decided your horizon. On June 15th, 1966, his 19th birthday, Blanco reports before 8 in the morning to a stadium in a neighborhood called Dolores, remembered as Camp Armada. He is assigned to Military Committee 701. Around him are hundreds of other young men, some recall about 500, waiting in that strange silence that happens when nobody knows the rules. Names are called. Each man answers here, like school roll call, like church. Then the line moves. Notice the detail that repeats in testimony. Nobody tells them where they are going. Some had been lured the same way. A telegram, a promise of regular service. And the cruelty is in that word, regular, because regular means safe, predictable, honorable. Regular means your mother can sleep. Then comes the bus, guards front and back, rifles and bayonets as punctuation, and regular turns into a trap. Families don't know the destination. The boys don't know if they'll be allowed to warn anyone. Some scribble notes and toss them from windows like messages and bottles, except the ocean is asphalt and fear. Survivor accounts remember the trip from Havana to Camagüey as long and humiliating, 8 to 10 hours for some, with no bathroom stops. Bodies trapped together do what bodies do. Men urinated and defecated in the back. The smell became part of the ride. Through open windows, they begged strangers for water. voices spilling out into the dark like prayers. Some remember being transported by cargo train too, in conditions that made a human feel like freight. This is a system teaching you immediately that dignity is not part of the contract. Camagüey is a distance weaponized, far enough from Havana that a mother can't just show up and demand answers. The camps were scattered across rural zones, fenced and guarded, hidden in the way something can be known and still treated like a rumor. Some accounts describe local labor and technicians helping design and build camps quickly, within roughly a year, because a state can build a fence fast when it believes it is building the future. A fence doesn't need time to become a sentence. It only needs a wire and permission. Upon arrival, the intake ritual begins. Armed guards line the exits. Internees are shoved into a field or stadium-like space, the same geometry repeating. A crowd, a voice, an authority above you. Survivors remember speeches that sound less like education and more like prophecy. From here, you leave in one of two ways. Either re-educated, meaning remade into a revolutionary, or dead. No third option. The camp introduces itself as a trap, and you understand that aid is not a gift. It is a sentence that wears uniform. Then the stripping begins, and not only of clothing, names are taken, men are assigned numbers as if they are inventory. 2 uniforms are issued, an olive green set saved for visits, and a blue mixed fiber uniform for daily use. Tools are handed out like extensions of your new identity, a hoe, and a machete. Before you've eaten dinner, the camp has rewritten you. You are no longer a son or a neighbor. You are a number with a blade. That's how the body becomes property without the state ever saying the word property. The official framing called these units a productive branch of compulsory service, defending the homeland not with weapons, but by increasing agricultural production. Some official explanations later grouped internees into categories: those with low education not fit to handle arms, those whose faith made them conscientious objectors, and homosexual men with adequate physical condition. Notice what that does. It makes the camp sound practical, almost gentle, not punishment, assignment, not coercion, allocation. The language is designed to make the fence disappear in the listener's mind. But inside, the daily rhythm was designed to be simple and relentless. Dawn, roll call, a meager breakfast, 10 hours of agricultural labor under a sun that doesn't care about slogans, often 10 or 11 hours, sometimes more. After the body is emptied, the mind is filled. Classes on ideology, revolutionary instruction, military courtesy, preparation for combat as a posture, even when you never hold a gun. Work and study. Work and study. Repetition is not only a discipline, it is a cage built from time. Re-education was the word. But notice what the word hides. It is not a classroom. It is a pressure chamber. Survivors describe being stripped of identity, forced to answer to numbers, and trained into obedience through exhaustion and humiliation. The goal was not only to produce sugar, it was to produce a certain kind of citizen, disciplined, obedient, reshaped. The horror comes from routine, how ordinary the machinery becomes. You can build cruelty into a schedule and call the schedule a moral duty. So who got sent? Sometimes it was obvious, a public marker of difference. Sometimes it was a file opened by a neighbor's complaint. The net was wide. Hippies and young men accused of improper conduct, religious believers, Jehovah's Witnesses, Catholics, evangelical groups, men labeled vagrants, dissidents, people applying for passports, people suspected of not loving the revolution loudly enough. In that fortress logic, wanting to leave could look like betrayal. Even listening to the wrong music could be treated as a foreign agent in your living room. For LGBT prisoners, the stigma had a special, sharpened edge. Homosexuality was framed as antisocial behavior, a moral failure, even a political risk, because the revolution's ideal masculinity demanded hardness, discipline, and combativeness. Under that pressure, socialist morality became a tool of policing the body. But the hypocrisy was thick. Some artists and performers were protected by connections, while others were crushed for the same deviance. Power always keeps a back door for the useful. Inside the camps, sorting continued because segregation prevents solidarity. Guards divided men by why they were there: religion, sexuality, and behavior. Gay men described being separated into platoons, sometimes selected and transferred in front of others. Humiliation packaged as logistics. The fear wasn't only that dissent was spreading, it was contamination, as if identity were infection. When a state treats differences like a disease, it starts building quarantines with people. And the quarantines become places where cruelty can hide, because the public is taught not to care what happens inside. There's even a camp remembered as built to concentrate gay internees, Camp the Union, in the Vertientes area of Camagüey. Listen to that name, the Union. It sounds like community, like a hand offered. But in practice, It was isolation sharpened into policy, a fence pretending to be family. Survivor recollections also describe religious prisoners being moved there as punishment, mixing different stigmas under one roof. The state doesn't need to beat everyone when it can let prejudice do half the work. Then there are the clinics, the part of the story that feels like a nightmare pretending to be medicine. Survivor accounts describe doctors, psychologists, and experts lending science to cruelty. One logic repeated in memories is blunt. Marxist philosophy plus forced labor would produce masculine consciousness and gestures. So some camps became laboratories. Reports include hormonal and chemical psychiatric treatments, drug therapies, and Pavlovian-style experiments, electric shocks, insulin, images flash like traps, trying to correct desire as if the heart were a machine with wrong settings. Imagine it, your hand still vibrating from the machete, your back carrying the day, and then you're marched into a room that smells like disinfectant and dread. A photo is shown, a question is asked. Your body reacts like a body, and the state calls your body an enemy. Details vary because the archive is incomplete, but the pattern is steady. Pain dressed up as correction, humiliation called therapy. Prisoners learned what answers doctors wanted because sometimes survival is theater, and theater is the last weapon you have. Heberto Padilla described that survival theater. Shown images of nude women, men shouted approval on command, performing desire like a password. Shown nude men, they acted sickened, as if they could vomit their own memory out of their bodies. How could I have ever looked at such a thing? Becomes a line you learn to say if you want the experiment to end. Re-education wasn't only labor. It was a coerced confession. Confession that your own self was wrong. Confession is a ritual of submission. But even in cages, people create small rebellions. Many gay internees were artists, writers, performers, people with imagination, exactly the kind of mind a rigid system fears. They staged plays in barracks, sometimes mocking seriousness by repeating slogans until they sounded ridiculous. They decorated the space with scraps, paper flowers, clippings, and curtains from nothing. Proof that imagination can survive when sleep cannot. For religious prisoners, memory became a Bible when books were restricted. In a camp designed to erase identity, remembering who you are becomes resistance. Now step into the world of the religious prisoners, and you'll feel the temperature shift. Jehovah's Witnesses were targeted because their faith forbade arms and flag oaths. Foreign-born witnesses were expelled. Mail was restricted, so they could not import or distribute literature. In places like Pinar del Rio, Kingdom halls were shut, and CDR officials reported gatherings. By the mid-1960s, persecution peaked, and the UMIP became a destination for believers. Not because they were violent, but because they would not perform loyalty the way the state demanded. Inside the camps, witnesses faced special restrictions. No family visits, no leaving, no mail. Isolation came first. Then Saturdays became a battlefield. Orders were issued after roll call and a thin breakfast. Most obeyed because hunger teaches obedience. But many witnesses refused Saturday labor, and that refusal touched the raw nerve of the system. The state could tolerate differences only if it bowed, and conscience does not bow easily. So punishment returned like a tide, reliable and cruel. Punishment was designed to be public because public pain educates better than private pain. Survivors describe witnesses forced to stoop and clean sewage ditches with their hands. Others were buried neck deep in soil, dirt stuffed into mouths until breathing became negotiation. Some were thrown onto ant piles. Guards staged fake firing squads, lining men up, firing into the air, then turning to the rest and saying, "Obey, or you're next." Fear is used as a public lesson. Fear turned into discipline. Payday became a flashpoint. The military wage remembered in accounts is about 7 pesos a month, and groups of witnesses refused to accept it, believing it would make them complicit. Guards answered with machine gun butts, smacking them until the fence line wobbled. Soldiers arrived. Shots cracked into the air. The message wasn't about money. It was about submission. Even your refusal had to be punished. So the rest of the camp would learn what resistance costs in this place. Another scene repeats like a curse. Witnesses were placed against a wall. A soldier mocked them. "You believe in God? Tell God to save you." Then gunfire tore the air around their bodies, close enough to make skin flinch, not always close enough to kill. It was a theater of terror, meant to teach the camp that faith is foolish. But fear isn't always obedient. Sometimes fear hardens into refusal, and refusal is what the system hates most, because it proves power is not absolute. Then came rope. A guard returns with a jeep. A man's wrists are tied. The rope loops around the bumper. The engine revs. The jeep moves, and the prisoner runs until his legs give out. Then he is dragged, dust and blood mixing into paste. Onlookers freeze because helping could make them next. When the jeep stops, The victim lies limp, skin peeling at a touch. Doctors treat wounds so labor can continue. Healing here is maintenance, fixing a tool so it can be used again. Accounts also describe hanging punishments. A doctor named Lovio, working in the camps from 1966 to the summer of 1967, wrote of a young believer hung by his wrist from a flagpole, hands raw, bloody, numb. Other eyewitnesses remembered prisoners hung by their feet. A witness named Ursulo Brito was kept hanging by his feet from a roof for some time. The body becomes a message board. The message is always the same. Your conscience is not yours here. Barbed wire wasn't only a fence, it became punishment itself. Survivors describe guards forcing a man to strip naked, then building a small cage of wire around his standing body, a piece of wood placed on top so the wire held shape. In tropical humidity, mosquitoes swarmed and fed on bare flesh. Some were released by day's end, others were left overnight, 12, 16, or 24 hours, without food or water. Campmates snuck out with sips of mercy, risking becoming the next lesson. Another testimony describes discipline by deprivation. Food was withheld for 12 consecutive days. Water once a day, exposure to the sun and rain. By the 11th day, prisoners were placed in a tank full of water. Beatings followed. Cold water was thrown at night. Oxen yokes forced around heads. Twice, firing squads were prepared, and the order to fire was given, then withheld, so the mind would live inside panic. The purpose wasn't only pain, it was psychological ownership, teaching the body that the future belongs to the guard. One detail matters here because it protects the story from becoming a simple hatred tale. Some Christians were forced to live in barracks with homosexual men, a move meant to add stigma and fracture morale. But a witness recalled that after conversation and mutual respect, the guards' plan didn't fully work. Solidarity appeared in the cracks. That is the island's intelligence showing itself, the ability of ordinary people to recognize each other as human, even when a system tries to assign them as enemies. The state fears recognition more than it fears any foreign power. Now zoom out above the cane fields, and the design looks clean from the sky. Rows upon rows, tiny figures are moving. A fence line cuts through the landscape. This is why the UMAP belongs to a broader architecture. Forced labor was a tool, yes, but surveillance was the blueprint. These camps remove perceived associating factors from the capital, from neighborhoods, from the revolution's daily performance. Rural exile is a message. Your empty chair will teach your family to behave. Your silence will teach your block what questions cost. Outside the wire, civilians often avoided eye contact with inner knees brought for checkups, because pity itself could look suspicious. One survivor remembered a clinic secretary, Maria Isabel Torres, as the rare person who spoke to them like humans, helping send a telegram home, something like, "I am doing well, give a kiss to mommy." Meanwhile, others spat shamelessly and shouted slogans, "Long live the revolution," as if words could scrub guilt clean. That social cruelty is part of the system. The state writes the label, and the street helps enforce it. And here's a crucial thing the record insists on. The UMAP was not exactly a secret. It was publicly discussed in certain ways, with certain silences. In the late 1960s, Verde Olivo ran a photo series showing smiling cane cutters carrying flags that marked them as millionaires, like other harvest propaganda. Articles praised production, highlighted achievements, and treated the units as honorable service. That matters because propaganda wasn't hiding the camps entirely. It was hiding the reality inside them. Granma also ran features describing the camps as youth formation and productive service, emphasizing discipline and respect. Publications function like staged photographs at a crime scene. They show you what the state wanted the public to see, and by contrast, they show what the state refused to show. And the refusal is loud. Reports could discuss Jehovah's Witnesses openly, but almost never named homosexual prisoners. Absence becomes evidence. Silence becomes part of the design. The archive speaks loudest when it refuses to speak. Why highlight Jehovah's Witnesses? Because the regime needed a reformable enemy for public consumption. The believer who refuses the flag can be framed as stubborn, but recoverable through labor and instruction. The gay prisoner cannot be shown without forcing the nation to stare at violence justified by morality. So gay men were erased from the official frame while their labor remained inside it. This is how a state controls memory. It curates which victims are allowed to exist publicly and which victims must remain unnamed, even while suffering. And underneath all of this is sugar, older than any ideology. Cuba's sugar boom expanded from the late 1700s onward, built on enslaved labor and colonial extraction. When the enslaved of Saint Domingue rose in 1791 and Haiti later became isolated, Cuba gained a sugar supplier and plantations expanded. Sweetness is exported, bitterness is kept on the island. So when survivors compared the UMAP to slavery, they weren't reaching for poetry. They were naming a feeling, the plantation returning in a new uniform, under a new moral language. This is also where the 10 million harvest of 1970 enters the story as a second act, not a separate topic. The state's plan aimed to reach 10 million tons of sugar, with staged yearly targets building toward that deadline. Speeches proclaimed that production would rise year by year, that the country would make history through labor. The island was told that all hands were necessary. That's the context in which any dissociating factor was treated as a threat. The UMAP becomes punishment and resource extraction, wrapped in national urgency. Now, notice the way language works at scale. Officials warned against negative postures toward work and equivocal attitudes of contempt for labor. Phrases that sound abstract until you see what they do to a human being. Once contempt for labor is defined as a disease, forced labor becomes treatment. Once foreign influence is defined as omnipresent, cultural difference becomes infiltration. Once the nation is framed as a besieged fortress, dissent becomes sabotage. Then you don't need courts. You need buses. This is why periodic crackdowns make sense in the system's logic. You can't keep a fortress without occasional displays of power. And late in 1968, foreign reporting described a scene that feels like a smaller echo of the UMAP pipeline. Police ringing a Havana neighborhood, loading long-haired youths, hippies. The paper called them into Leyland buses, driving them to stations, then releasing those who could prove they worked or belonged to official mass organizations. Those who could not prove it were sent to state farms for work and study rehabilitation. Paperwork is fate, again. In speeches, Castro could insist the revolution never abused its power, and that power belonged to the nation, and the crowd would applaud. Then, almost casually, he could list destinations for the few who disagreed: prison, military service, the UMAP rehabilitation centers. Applause matters. It's fear turned into consent. It's the sound of people choosing safety over solidarity. It's not because they were monsters. It's because the system taught them that survival required agreement, or at least the performance of agreement. And inside the camps, that performance became daily practice. You learn when to cheer, when to look down, when to answer quickly, and when to be invisible. You learn the guards' moods, the way farmers read weather, tiny signs, approaching storms. You learn not to ask questions in public. You learn that the safest language is the language the system expects from you. This is how the horror emerges from routine, not only in spectacular punishments, but in the slow reshaping of human behavior until fear becomes second nature. Still, even a disciplined system cannot fully erase the human. Campmates smuggled water to men in wire cages at night. A secretary helped a prisoner send a telegram home. Prisoners staged plays. Believers prayed without books. People learned to recognize each other across categories that the state tried to weaponize. Those gestures matter because they defend Latin memory, showing the island's intelligence, not reducing victims to passive objects. The state tried to create a single narrative, but lived life creates many narratives, and that plurality is what power cannot control forever. By 1968, backlash had grown enough that authorities began removing prisoners, and by 1969, the operation was closed. Then comes the classic move: records destroyed, activities classified, memory managed. A gap opens in official history, not because nothing happened, but because someone worked to make it hard to prove. When the files disappear, survivors become the archive. Their testimony becomes the evidence bag, and the existence of that gap becomes part of the crime itself, because erasure is an abuse too. This is where numbers must be handled with respect. Later reconstructions and survivor networks estimate that tens of thousands passed through the UMAP, often framed around 30,000 to 35,000 people, with some accounts reaching higher. Human cost is recorded in fragments. Some reconstructions count at least 507 people pushed into psychiatric institutions after psychological torture, and at least 252 deaths tied to abuse. Destroyed files leave gaps, and the gaps mean totals are debated. But even the smallest confirmed count is a cemetery of stolen years. For a long time, official historiography avoided the topic almost completely. References appeared only obliquely, in hints and in foreign interviews. Meanwhile, exile testimony carried many of the most explicit survivor accounts, sometimes dismissed as biased precisely because they were personal and painful. That tension becomes another part of the story: a state that controls archives and a diaspora that preserves memory through testimony. One side has institutions, the other side has scars. Truth lives where those collide, not where one side wins. There were moments when Castro acknowledged injustice, including the persecution of homosexuals in the 1960s, and other moments when public figures softened language, rejecting certain comparisons and insisting on different terms. That swing, admission, then dilution is how a state keeps control of narrative without fully denying what happened. Admission without repair becomes another silence. Accountability becomes foggy, and fog is useful because fog makes the public argue about words while victims remain unheard. This is also why sensational conspiracy framings don't help. You don't need secret aliens or foreign puppeteers to explain a bus, a fence, and a work schedule. The evidence left behind shows a structure with its own internal logic. Sugar plans, fortress mentality, moral absolutism, neighborhood surveillance, propaganda management, and a concept of the new man that treated certain humans as raw material to reshape. Calling it a cartoon plot erases local responsibility and local intelligence at the same time. The street remembers reality. Reality is heavy enough. And remember, the UMAP was not one single camp. It was a network, multiple sites across Camagüey with different guards, different conditions, changes over time. Some accounts say conditions improved in some camps after mid-1966, better food, different routines, like a predator learning to hide its teeth. But the purpose remained. Isolate, discipline, reassign, warn. No matter which gate you woke up behind, you were inside the same lesson. The lesson was that the state could reorder your life at will. So what does re-education mean? Emotionally, it means forced aging. Blanco used that phrase, forced aging, like fruit ripening too fast inside paper. You enter young, you come out older, even if the calendar insists you are still young. You learn distrust as survival. You learn silence as safety. Your family learns the state can borrow your son and return him altered, or not return him at all. The greatest crime isn't only what happens inside the wire. It's what the wire makes ordinary outside it. The flinch, the whisper, the fear of being seen. And that's why the 10 million harvest of 1970 matters as a memory pivot. The country was redirected into mass mobilization, labor framed as heroic sacrifice, youth sent to fields, and national attention flooded with production targets and patriotic imagery. In that flood, certain memories sank. The machinery of forced labor could be repainted as a collective effort. The UMAP could be pushed into shadow, treated as an unfortunate detail, a footnote, a stain nobody wanted to touch. That is not accidental. That is how states manage memory, not only by erasing, but by burying under louder narratives. Years later, survivors formed associations, recorded testimonies, guarded first-person truth like a sacred object, because they knew the state preferred fragments. Reconstruction grew in books, interviews, and scattered references, forcing silence to crack. Yet the tension remains. Some want to define the camps as training, others as crime, others as mistake. The argument over words is not academic. Words decide whose pain counts, whose voice is allowed, whose memory becomes official, and whose memory is treated like pollution. So let's be careful and honest. This was not industrial extermination. The goal was not to erase a population physically the way certain 20th century death systems did. Here, the goal was social engineering, breaking and reshaping people through labor, isolation, ideological pressure, humiliation, and fear. Different machinery, same human cost for the person inside it. And the Cuban logic matters because it is how we defend local memory. By describing the system as it was, not as a borrowed metaphor that makes outsiders comfortable. Now, zoom in again on the small objects that hold the whole story. The envelope is on the table, the stamp, the stadium roll call, the number assigned to a man whose mother still calls him by his name. The blue uniform for daily use, the olive green uniform is saved for visits, because even cruelty has costume changes. Machete, the hoe, the flags held by millionaires in propaganda photos, the barbed wire that becomes a cage, these objects recur like refrains, because the system was built from ordinary materials made sacred by power. And the most terrifying object of all is not the machete, it's the notebook. The neighborhood notebook, the CDR list, because a fence in Camagüey begins on a block in Havana when someone decides you are different and writes it down. Surveillance is not only spying, it's teaching the population to police itself. It's teaching the street to flinch at difference. It's teaching neighbors to choose safety over solidarity. It's making fear into civic duty and then calling that duty love of country. So we return to the envelope on the table, paper breathing, a stamp like a kiss. The letter doesn't have to mention barbed wire. It doesn't have to say camp. It only has to summon you, and the rest of the country only has to look away. That's the horror of early consolidation, when power becomes routine and routine becomes moral law. The files whisper even when burned. The street remembers the empty chair. The land keeps receipts under the cane. And now I want to ask you something quietly, like we're still around that fire. If your neighbor's notebook could send you to the fields, what would you hide? A song, a prayer, a love letter, a book with the wrong author's name? Or would you refuse to hide and risk becoming a warning for everyone else? Tell me in the comments which object haunts you most, the letter, the bus, the uniform, the machete, or the barbed wire, and what memory it wakes up in you. Not a debate, a memory. Muchas gracias. Thanks for trekking the hidden trails of Latin America with me. If tonight's story unsettled you, subscribe and ring the bell, because Latin America's most intriguing stories are far from over.